The envelope was neon orange, not a friendly, happy Halloween pumpkin orange, nor a safety-conscious caution, men at work orange. This was a violent, radioactive tangerine designed specifically to induce cardiac arrhythmias in suburban dads. It was taped to my front door with blue painter's tape, right at eye level. I stood there, holding my morning coffee. A dark roast that suddenly tasted like anxiety, and stared at it. Even before I peeled it off the wood, I could smell it. It smelled of synthetic lavender and unbridled judgment. There was only one person in the Whispering Pines estates who possessed stationery of this chromatic intensity and a perfume budget that could fund a small nation's military. Mrs. Linda Higgins, president of the Homeowners Association, keeper of the covenants, and a woman who once measured my grass with a laser ruler she bought on Amazon. I set my coffee down on the porch railing, ripped the tape, and opened the envelope. The letter inside was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock. The header featured the Whispering Pines logo, a pine tree that looked suspiciously like a cell tower, and the text was single-spaced, justified, and bolded in all the wrong places. Notice of violation. Class C. Infraction. Illicit rodent. Attraction and unsanctioned feeding of vermin. Dear homeowner, David Miller. It has come to the attention of the board that you are currently operating an unregulated feeding station for local wildlife, specifically the eastern gray squirrel, Squirrus carolinensis, which is classified under Section 4.2 of the Community Guidelines as nuisance vermin. Witnesses, myself, have observed you willfully distributing Class A legumes, peanuts, onto your rear decking area. This behavior encourages infestation, lowers property values, and is frankly disgusting. You have 24 hours to cease and desist all interaction with the vermin and remove all unattended food sources. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $500 and a possible lien on your property. Govern yourself accordingly, Mrs. Linda Higgins, HOA President. I lowered the letter. My hand was trembling, just a little. Illicit rodent attraction? I whispered to the empty yard. It's a handful of peanuts, Linda. It's not a squirrel rave. A soft, chittering noise came from the oak tree to my left. I looked up. Sitting on a low branch, tail twitching expectantly, was Chunky Steve. Chunky Steve was not just a squirrel. He was a force of nature. He was an obese, scarred veteran of the suburban wilds who had lost half an ear in a fight with a golden retriever, I assumed, and had a digestive system that could process drywall. He looked at me, then at the empty railing where the peanuts usually sat, and let out a disgruntled squeak. I know, Steve, I said, feeling a sudden surge of defensive patriotism. She called you vermin. She called you a Class C infraction. Steve flicked his tail. He didn't care about bureaucracy. He wanted a cashew. This isn't over, I told him. I grabbed the letter and marched down my driveway. Mrs. Higgins lived 3 houses down in a residence that could only be described as aggressively beige. Her lawn was not grass. It was a green carpet installed by God himself and maintained by chemical warfare. There wasn't a dandelion in sight. If a weed dared to sprout on Higgins's property, I assumed she simply glared at it until it withered and died out of respect. I stomped up her walkway, the orange letter crinkling in my fist. I didn't just ring the doorbell. I pressed it with the authority of a man who pays his dues on time. Ding dong. I waited. I could see a silhouette moving behind the frosted glass of the front door. I saw the shadow stop, turn, and then approach the door. But the door didn't open. Instead, a robotic voice echoed from the small plastic box mounted next to the jamb. "Hi, you are being recorded. How can I help you?" I stared at the Ring doorbell camera. Then I looked at the silhouette clearly visible 3 feet away behind the glass. "Linda, I can see you," I said, addressing the door. "You're standing right there? You're wearing that floral muumuu." The speaker crackled. "Mr. Miller, please state your business into the microphone." "I'm not talking to a doorbell when you're 2 feet away." "Safety protocol, David. You seem agitated. I can see the orange notification in your hand. I trust you have received the citation." "Citation? It's a threat, Linda. Illicit rodent attraction? Are you serious? I threw a few peanuts to a squirrel who looks like he's having a hard week. Since when is compassion a violation?" "Since Section 4.2, Paragraph 3, Linda's voice crackled, tinny and distorted. "Feeding vermin attracts rats, David. Rats attract snakes. Snakes attract coyotes. Do you want a coyote eating the Henderson's Shih Tzu? Is that what you want? The blood of Princess Fluffball on your hands?" "That is a slippery slope fallacy, and you know it," I shouted at the plastic camera lens. "And Steve isn't vermin. He's wildlife. He adds rustic charm to the neighborhood." "He is a rat with good PR," Linda shot back. "The bylaws are clear. No unattended food sources. If I see one more peanut on that deck, I am fining you $500. And I will check, David. I have binoculars, and I have time." "You can't tell me what to do on my own property." "Read the CCNRs, David. When you signed the deed, you signed your soul over to the Whispering Pines. You have 24 hours. Remove the food or pay the price." The silhouette turned and marched away into the bowels of the beige fortress. The Ring doorbell chirped. "Connection lost." I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the fisheye lens of the camera. I felt powerless. I felt small. I felt like a man who was about to lose a war against a woman who organized her spice rack alphabetically by genus. But then, a thought occurred, to me. A dangerous, petty thought. "Read the CCNRs," she had said. I looked back at my house. I looked at Chunky Steve, who had followed me and was now watching from a telephone wire, judging my negotiation skills. "Challenge accepted, Linda," I muttered. "Challenge accepted." By 8:00 p.m., the dining room table looked like the workspace of a conspiracy theorist trying to prove the moon landing was faked on a soundstage in Arizona. I had poured myself a generous glass of bourbon. 2 fingers, neat, because ice takes up valuable room that could be used for more whiskey. Next to the glass lay the Bylaw Bible. It was a 4-inch thick binder titled Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions of Whispering Pines Estates. It was the document we had all signed at closing, mostly without reading, because who actually reads 400 pages of legal gibberish about fence heights and acceptable shades of mulch? I did. Tonight, I did. I sat under the harsh glow of the chandelier, turning pages with the fervor of a biblical scholar looking for a hidden commandment. Article 6? Aesthetics? No, I mumbled, flipping a page. Article 7? Noise ordinances? No lawn mowing before 8 a.m. Boring. Article 9? Holiday decorations? All inflatable Santas must be deflated by January 5th. Draconian, but irrelevant. I took a sip of bourbon. It burned, sharp and clarifying. I needed to find a way to feed Steve without scattering food. The violation specifically cited ground scattering and unattended food sources. I turned to Section 14, Animal Control and Husbandry. I scanned the text, my finger tracing the lines. Section 14, A. No livestock, poultry, or exotic beasts. Section 14, B, bird feeders and wildlife interaction. Here it was, the holy text. Residents are prohibited from the use of platform feeders that allow for the ground scattering of feed, as this attracts unwanted pests. Suspended tube feeders are permitted for avian species only. I groaned. Ground scattering. That was the nail in the coffin. If I threw a peanut on the deck, it was technically ground scattered. But then, I read the next sentence. All food service provided to permitted wildlife must be conducted within a designated dining structure or containment unit to prevent spillage. I paused. I reread it. Designated dining structure. The language was clearly intended to mean some kind of enclosed bird feeder with a tray. But it didn't say bird feeder. It said dining structure. My brain began to itch. A dining structure implies dining. It implies tables, chairs, a roof. I grabbed a yellow highlighter and slashed a line through the text. Then I flipped frantically to Section 8, Architectural Control. If I built a structure, I usually needed HOA approval, and Linda would never approve a squirrel feeder. She would burn my application on her front lawn as a warning to others. I scanned the architectural codes. Fences, pools, sheds. Section 8.d, outbuildings and accessory structures. Any permanent structure exceeding 100 square feet or exceeding 3 feet in height requires full architectural review and board approval. I froze. I read it again. Exceeding 3 feet in height. I did the math in my head. If a structure was under 3 feet in height, it didn't require review. It didn't require approval. A slow, maniacal grin spread across my face. I took another sip of bourbon, but this time it tasted like victory. If I built a dining structure that contained the food, preventing scattering, and it was under 3 feet tall, I was legally untouchable. The bylaws didn't specify who the dining structure was for. It just said food service. The front door opened. My wife, Sarah, walked in. She was wearing scrubs, looking exhausted after a 12-hour shift at the hospital, saving actual human lives. She dropped her keys in the bowl and looked at me. She saw the bourbon. She saw the binder. She saw the manic glint in my eyes that usually preceded a trip to the emergency room or a call to a lawyer. "Oh no," she said. "Dave, what did you do?" "I found it, Sarah," I said, tapping the binder. "I found the loophole." She walked over, picked up the orange violation letter from the table, and sighed. "Mrs. Higgins, again?" "She threatened Chunky Steve, Sarah. She called him a Class C infraction." "He ate the wiring in your truck last year, Dave. He cost us $400. "That was a cry for help. He was acting out." I stood up, pacing the room. "Look, she says I can't throw peanuts on the ground. Fine, I won't throw them. I will serve them." Sarah rubbed her temples. "Please tell me you aren't going to sue the HOA." "Better," I said. "I'm going to comply. Maliciously, Section 14b allows for a designated dining structure, and Section 8d says anything under 3 feet doesn't need a permit." I grabbed a napkin and a Sharpie. "I'm not just going to build a feeder, Sarah. That's what she expects. She expects a tube with seeds." I began to sketch furiously. "I'm going to build a restaurant, a fine dining establishment, white tablecloths, mahogany finish, a maitre d' stand." Sarah peered at the napkin. "Dave, is that a tiny handicap ramp?" "ADA compliant," I shouted. "We have to be inclusive. Some of the squirrels have arthritis. Old Henderson's cat maimed half the population." Dave, Sarah said, her voice soft, reasonable. It's a $500 fine. We can just pay it. We can just stop feeding the squirrels. I looked at her. I loved this woman. She was the anchor to my balloon. But she didn't understand. This wasn't about peanuts anymore. This was about the spirit of American liberty. It's the principle, Sarah, I said, looking deep into her eyes. It's about freedom. It's about staring tyranny in the face and saying, "Do you have a reservation?" Sarah stared at me for a long, silent minute. She looked at the bourbon. She looked at the binder. Finally, she walked over, kissed me on the cheek, and grabbed the bottle of whiskey. "I'm going to bed," she said. "If you bankrupt us building a squirrel gazebo, I'm taking half." "It's not a gazebo," I called after her as she ascended the stairs. "It's a bistro. It's going to be cultural." I turned back to the empty room. The silence was heavy with potential. I needed wood. I needed blueprints. But most of all, I needed a contractor who wouldn't ask too many questions. I needed Tony. I picked up my phone. It was 8:45 p.m., late for a business call, but Tony the Wall Moretti wasn't a 9-to-5 kind of guy. He was the kind of guy who framed houses in a blizzard in shorts. I dialed. "Yeah?" Tony's voice sounded like a cement mixer full of gravel. "Tony, it's Dave Miller. I have a job." "Dave? It's dark out. Your roof leak again?" "No, I need a custom build. High-end. Intricate detail. Load-bearing beams. Waterproofing. The works." There was a pause. I could hear Tony lighting a cigarette. "I'm listening. What are we talking? Guest house? Pool cabana?" "Smaller," I said. "Shed?" "Smaller." "Dave, what are we building?" I took a breath. "Tony," I said, "I need you to build the finest 112-scale Victorian dining establishment this county has ever seen, and I need it by Tuesday." There was a long silence on the line. "Is there cash involved?" "Triple your hourly rate." "I'll be there at 7 a.m. I hung up the phone and looked out the window into the dark backyard. Somewhere out there, Mrs. Higgins was sleeping, dreaming of perfectly parallel trash cans. She had no idea what was coming. The Nutty Bistro was open for business. I was standing on the back deck at 6:55 a.m., shivering in my bathrobe, holding a cup of coffee that was rapidly losing its heat to the morning chill. The sun was just beginning to crest over the roof of the Higgins residence, casting long, accusatory shadows across my lawn. I heard him before I saw him. A deep, guttural rumble vibrated through the pavement of the cul-de-sac. It sounded like a tectonic plate shifting, or perhaps a dinosaur gargling rocks. A massive Ford F-350, lifted so high it probably required oxygen masks in the cab, rounded the corner. It was matte black. It had a bumper sticker that read, "I don't break for physics." This was Tony the Wall Moretti. Tony was a legend in the local contracting scene. He didn't build decks, he built fortifications. He was the guy you called when you wanted a retaining wall that would survive a nuclear winter. He was 6'4", shaped like a vending machine made of brisket, and allegedly had a rivet gun for a hand. The truck pulled into my driveway, crushing a stray acorn under a tire the size of a jacuzzi. The engine cut, followed by a silence so heavy it felt physical. Tony climbed out. He was wearing a Carhartt jacket that had seen more combat than most tanks, and he held a clipboard like a weapon. He didn't walk, he advanced. I tightened the sash of my bathrobe and tried to look like a man who commanded respect, rather than a man currently at war with a woman named Linda over peanuts. "Dave," Tony grunted, stopping at the bottom of the deck stairs. He didn't look at me. He was already scanning the property, looking for structural weaknesses. "Tony, thanks for coming on such short notice. Triple rate, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, like gravity. Triple rate, I confirmed. He nodded. He climbed the stairs, the wood groaning in protest under his work boots. He stopped in the center of the deck, pulled a tape measure from his belt with the speed of a gunslinger drawing a Colt .45, and looked at me. So, what are we doing? Extension? You want a pergola? I see you got some rot on that railing. I can rip that out, put in pressure-treated cedar. Last you 50 years. I took a deep breath. This was the moment. I don't need a pergola, Tony. I need a bistro. Tony paused. He retracted the tape measure. Zip. A bistro, he repeated. Like an outdoor kitchen? Pizza oven? Granite countertops? Not exactly. I reached into my robe pocket and pulled out the napkin of destiny. It was a crinkled, coffee-stained square of paper where I had sketched my vision the night before. I smoothed it out on the railing. I need a dining establishment, I said, pointing to the drawing. Victorian aesthetic, gingerbread trim, wraparound porch, a load-bearing roof capable of withstanding wind, rain, and the impact of a 3-pound rodent falling from an oak tree. Tony leaned in. He squinted at the napkin. His thick fingers hovered over the drawing. Dave, he said slowly, this drawing. There's no scale here. But based on the size of this, is that a peanut? It is. And this structure, relative to the peanut, Tony looked up. His eyes were dark pools of confusion. How big is this thing? Scale is 1/12, I said firmly. The footprint needs to be roughly 12 inches by 12 inches, maybe 18 if we add the VIP lounge. Tony stared at me. A blue jay screamed in the distance, breaking the silence. Inches, Tony said. Correct. You want me, Tony Moretti, the guy who poured the foundation for the municipal parking garage, to build a dollhouse? It is not a dollhouse, Tony, I snapped. It is a spite restaurant. There is a difference. I quickly explained the situation. The letter, Mrs. Higgins, the illicit rodent attraction. The loophole in Section 8.d regarding structures under 3 feet. As I spoke, Tony's expression shifted. He went from confused to annoyed, and then, as I described Mrs. Higgins measuring my grass with a laser, something flickered in his eyes. A spark. Tony Moretti, it turned out, had an ex-wife who was the treasurer of her HOA. She said, "Vermin?" Tony asked, his voice dropping an octave. She called them a Class C infraction. Tony looked at the napkin again. He looked at the deck. He looked at Chunky Steve, who was currently burying a walnut in my potted petunias. "And you want it to be code compliant?" Tony asked. "Strictly. It has to be a designated dining structure. It needs a roof. It needs a floor. It needs to be structurally sound enough that if she kicks it, she breaks her toe, not the building." Tony pulled a pencil from behind his ear. He tapped the napkin. "Victorian is good," he mused, mostly to himself. "But you got drainage issues here. If we don't elevate the foundation, you're going to get rot in the floor joists. We need a concrete pad, maybe a floating slab." I blinked. "For a squirrel house?" "For the bistro," Tony corrected me, looking offended. "You want a load-bearing roof? We need trusses, mini trusses. I can rip down some 2x4s. We'll use marine-grade plywood for the subfloor. And for the finish." He looked at me, his eyes blazing with a sudden, terrifying, artistic passion. "Mahogany," Tony whispered. We use mahogany scraps and copper flashing for the roof. It'll patina nicely. Tony, I was thinking popsicle sticks and glue. Tony looked at me with deep disgust. Popsicle sticks? You hire Tony Moretti? You don't get popsicle sticks. You get craftsmanship. You get legacy. He grabbed his phone. I'm calling my lumber guy. We need to go to the depot, and I'm gonna need a table saw with a very fine blade. He started walking back to his truck, shouting into his phone. Yeah, Mike? It's Tony. I need quarter-sawn oak. No, I don't care that you don't sell it in 3-inch strips. Cut it. It's a custom job. And get me the tiny nails, the really tiny nails, the ones for... Look, just get them. I stood on the deck, watching him go. I had unleashed a monster. I had hired a man who built bunkers to build a squirrel cafe. I looked at Chunky Steve. You better tip well, I told him. If you have never argued with a Home Depot employee about whether a specific wood stain brings out the warmth of a rodent's fur, you haven't lived. We were in aisle 12. Tony was pushing a flatbed cart that contained 3 sheets of marine-grade plywood, a bucket of quickset concrete, a sheet of copper, and a 200 Dremel kit he claimed was essential tooling. I was holding a can of espresso bean wood stain. It's too dark, Dave, Tony said, shaking his head. He was holding a piece of cedar trim he had found in the scrap bin. You go espresso, you lose the grain. It looks cheap. We want golden pecan. It's thematic. Tony, it's a squirrel. He's colorblind. We don't build for the client's vision, Tony said, snatching the can from my hand and replacing it with the pecan. We build for the integrity of the structure. Now, let's talk lighting. Solar? Solar. For the evening crowd, I saw some walkway lights in aisle 4. If I strip the casing, I can wire them into the eaves. Little sconces. Very classy. Tony, the budget. We are already at $400. You want to beat Higgins, or you want to play games? Tony asked, staring me down. She has binoculars, Dave. If she looks through those lenses and sees a shoddy glue gun job, she wins. She sees art. She sees architecture. She crumbles. God help me, he was right. We bought the solar lights. We also bought a tiny velvet rope from the holiday section, intended for a Christmas elf display, and a bag of white landscaping stones that Tony insisted were for drainage and aesthetics. Back at the house, the construction site was officially opened. Tony didn't just set up a table on the deck. He set up a perimeter. He used yellow caution tape, which he cut into thin strips, to cordon off a 2-foot square section of the deck. He put on safety goggles. He put on ear protection. The sound of the table saw ripping a single popsicle stick in half lengthwise is a unique sound. It is a high-pitched zip that sounds like a mosquito screaming. Tony worked with the focus of a bomb defusal expert. He measured. He cut. He sanded. He swore fluently in Italian when a piece of trim was off by a millimeter. It's not plumb, he muttered, holding a tiny level against a 3-inch support beam. Dave, hand me the tweezers. I handed him the tweezers. He used them to adjust a microscopic shim under the floorboard. Perfect, he whispered. By noon, the skeleton of the bistro was up. It was magnificent. It had a vaulted ceiling. It had a tiny wraparound porch with a railing made of toothpicks that Tony had stained individually. I was sitting in a lawn chair, drinking a beer, watching a 250-pound man install a roof shingle the size of a thumbnail, when I heard a cough from the fence line. I turned. Mr. Henderson was standing there. Mr. Henderson was 80 years old, wore suspenders every day of his life, and spent most of his time yelling at clouds. He leaned over the fence, squinting at Tony. "What in the Sam Hill is that?" Henderson barked. "It's a bistro," I said. Henderson stared. "For who? The borrowers? For the Squirrels, I said. HOA says I can't throw food, so I'm opening a restaurant. Henderson looked at the structure. He looked at Tony, who was currently using a syringe to apply wood glue to a tiny cornice. Is that copper flashing? Henderson asked. It is, Tony grunted, not looking up. Hand crimped. Henderson was silent for a long moment. I expected mockery. I expected him to call Linda. I expected him to tell me I had finally snapped. Instead, he reached into his pocket. I got some slate, he said. Left over from the bathroom redo in '98. Might make a nice patio. I looked at him. You want to contribute to the Squirrel Bistro? Higgins wrote me up last week, Henderson spat. Said my garden gnome was lewd because his shirt was unbuttoned. You take the slate. He tossed a piece of gray stone over the fence. It landed in the grass with a thud. Thanks, Mr. Henderson. Make it nice, Henderson grunted, turning back to his house. Make it so nice it hurts her eyes. By 4:00 p.m., it was finished. It was breathtaking. The Nutty Bistro stood 12 inches high. The mahogany floor gleamed under 3 coats of polyurethane. The copper roof caught the afternoon sun. The tiny solar sconces were wired and ready. Tony had even built furniture. There were 4 tables. They were made from wooden spools he had found in Sarah's sewing kit, stained to match the floor. The chairs were crafted from champagne wire cages. Tony had raided my recycling bin, twisted into elegant wrought iron style seating. And then, the pièce de résistance. Tony reached into his pocket and pulled out a small rectangular object. He placed it near the entrance of the bistro, right next to the velvet rope. It was a sign. He had printed it on a label maker, but he had mounted it on a tiny easel. Please wait to be seated. Tony, I said, my voice thick with emotion. It's beautiful. Tony wiped sweat from his forehead with a rag. He looked at the bistro with the pride of a father, looking at his newborn child. Structure is solid, he said. Roof load is rated for 20 pounds. You could park a cat on that thing and it wouldn't buckle. Ventilation is adequate. And he pointed to the back of the bistro. I installed a grease trap. A grease trap? For the peanut oil. You don't want staining on the deck. Code is code, Dave. He packed up his tools. The bill was astronomical. It was enough to buy a very nice, human-sized dining set. But as I handed Tony the check, I knew it was worth every penny. Pleasure doing business with you, Tony said, shaking my hand. His grip was like a vice. If you need an expansion, maybe a guest cottage for the chipmunks, call me. He climbed into his truck. The engine roared to life. He backed out of the driveway, leaving a cloud of diesel fumes and triumph in his wake. I stood alone on the deck. The sun was setting. I went inside and grabbed the bag of premium, roasted, unsalted peanuts. I walked to the bistro. With the reverence of a priest placing a chalice upon an altar, I filled the tiny bowls on the tables. I adjusted the velvet rope. Then I waited. The first customer arrived 10 minutes later. It wasn't Chunky Steve. It was Twitchy, a nervous young male who always looked like he was late for a meeting. He skittered down the tree trunk, paused, and sniffed the air. He saw the bistro. He froze. He crept closer. He sniffed the mahogany. He inspected the ramp. He looked at the "Please wait to be seated" sign. He didn't read it, obviously, but he respected the aura of authority. He tentatively stepped onto the porch. His claws clicked on the wood, a distinct upscale sound, unlike the dull thud of the deck. He approached table 1. He sat on one of the champagne wire chairs. He picked up a peanut. And then he ate. He didn't scramble away. He didn't bury it. He sat at the table, looking out over the Squirrels' yard, dining like a gentleman. I pulled out my phone. I zoomed in. I snapped a picture. I texted it to Sarah with the caption, "Soft opening, full house." Then I turned my gaze toward Mrs. Higgins' house. The lights were on. I imagined her in there, sensing a disturbance in the bylaws. "Your move, Linda," I whispered. The war had begun, and we had the best fortifications in the county. The morning of the grand opening, I woke up with the jitters of a restaurateur facing his first dinner service. I checked the weather app. Clear skies, low humidity, perfect foraging conditions. Tony's craftsmanship was undeniable, but a restaurant is nothing without a menu. I sat at my desk with a pair of tweezers and a magnifying glass. I had spent the previous night designing the menu in Photoshop. I used a font called Edwardian script because Comic Sans felt disrespectful to the culinary arts. I printed them out. They were the size of postage stamps. I ran them through the laminator, which was tricky because the machine kept trying to eat them, but eventually I had 4 pristine, waterproof menus. The Nutty Bistro, spring tasting menu starters, the acorn soufflé, a deconstructed oak nut served on a bed of moss, sunflower seed medley, locally sourced, shell-on for texture, mains, the chunky, special, a whole walnut, cracked by hand, served with a side of peanut butter smear, trash can tartar, seasonal, a discarded crust of sourdough bread I found behind the toaster, dessert, the dried cranberry, aged to perfection in the pantry for 3 years. I walked out to the deck. The bistro gleamed. I placed a menu on each tiny table. I filled the water bowls, bottle caps from a craft beer collection, with fresh filtered water. "Service is in 10, I announced to the yard. The first rush hit around 9:00 a.m. Twitchy was back, and this time he brought a date, a sleek female squirrel with a bushy tail that I decided to name Duchess. They sat at table 2. Duchess seemed impressed by the copper roofing. Twitchy seemed nervous that a hawk might snatch him, but the overhead cover provided by the Victorian architecture seemed to calm him down. Then the heavy hitter arrived. Chunky Steve descended the oak tree like a furry elevator that had cut its cable. He hit the deck with a thud that rattled the grill. He waddled over to the bistro. He bypassed the "Please wait to be seated" sign. Steve was clearly the type who knew the owner, and squeezed himself into table 1. The chair creaked, but held. Tony Moretti, you genius. I stood by the sliding glass door, watching. It was magical. They were picking up the nuts with their little hands, turning them over, eating with dignity. There was no scattering, no chaos. Just civilized dining. I was so engrossed in watching Steve struggle with the sticky peanut butter that I didn't hear the sound of Velcro tearing. "David!" The scream was shrill enough to crack glass. I turned. Standing at the edge of her property line, clutching a pair of high-powered bird-watching binoculars, was Mrs. Higgins. She was wearing a visor that said "Gardening Queen," and she looked like she was about to inhale the entire atmosphere in rage. "Good morning, Linda," I called out, stepping onto the deck. "Beautiful day for al fresco dining, isn't it?" "What is that?" She pointed a trembling finger at the bistro. "That," I said, gesturing proudly, "is the Nutty Bistro. We're currently in our soft opening phase, so reservations are hard to get. But for you, I might be able to squeeze in a table for 4. Do you like walnuts?" "You are feeding them!" she shrieked. "I can see them eating. That is a violation. Section 4.2. Ah. I wagged a finger. Section 14B, Linda. All food service must be conducted within a designated dining structure. Look closely. Is there food on the ground? No. Is there scattering? No. It is contained within a Victorian-era establishment. She lowered the binoculars. Her face was a color that didn't exist in nature, a mix of purple and fury. "It is an unauthorized structure," she yelled. "You didn't file for a permit." "Section 8.D, I shouted back, feeling the adrenaline of legal superiority. "Structures under 3 feet do not require architectural review. I measured it, Linda. It is 12 inches tall. I could stack 2 of them and still be legal." She stared at me. She stared at the bistro. She stared at Chunky Steve, who was currently licking peanut butter off his paws and staring back at her with dead, soulless eyes. "It attracts vermin." "It attracts clients," I corrected. "It is an eyesore. It is mahogany. It is nicer than your gazebo, Linda, and we both know it." That was a low blow. Linda's gazebo was a prefab kit from Costco, and everyone knew she was insecure about the vinyl lattice. She gasped. She actually clutched her pearls. She was wearing pearls to garden. Of course she was. You verify this," she sputtered. "I am calling the board. I am calling the city. I am calling the police." "Call them!" I shouted, throwing my arms wide. "I have nothing to hide. My kitchen is clean. My staff is attentive." She turned and marched back into her house, slamming the door so hard I felt the vibration in my feet. I looked down at Chunky Steve. "I think she liked the ambiance," I said. Steve burped. 40 minutes later, the peace of the cul-de-sac was shattered by the whoop-whoop of a siren. I was expecting maybe a code enforcement officer, maybe a sternly worded email. I was not expecting a squad car. A Crown Victoria pulled up to the curb. The lights were flashing, reflecting off Mrs. Higgins' front window, where she was undoubtedly peeking through the blinds. A police officer stepped out. He looked to be in his late 40s, with the weary expression of a man who had joined the force to fight crime, but spent 90% of his time mediating disputes about fence lines and barking dogs. Namtag Reed Miller. No relation, thankfully. He adjusted his belt and walked up the driveway. I met him halfway. "Morning, officer," I said. "Mr. Miller?" he asked, checking a notepad. "That's me." "Mr. Miller, we received a call from a neighbor regarding—" He squinted at his notes, then frowned. "Illegal commercial activity in a residential zone, and potentially operating an unlicensed zoo?" I sighed. "Let me guess. Mrs. Higgins?" Officer Miller didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. "She claims you are running a restaurant out of your backyard that is attracting, and I quote, hordes of disease-ridden beasts. Officer, come with me." I led him to the backyard. We walked up the deck stairs. I pointed to the bistro. "There is the commercial enterprise," I said. Officer Miller stopped. He looked at the bistro. He looked at the tiny sign. He looked at Twitchy, who was currently nibbling a sunflower seed on the wrap-around porch. Miller blinked. He leaned in closer. "Is that a tiny velvet rope?" "Crowd control," I said solemnly. "We can't have just anyone walking in." Miller stood up slowly. He looked at me. The corners of his mouth were twitching. He was fighting a losing battle against professionalism. "Sir," he said, his voice straining to stay level, "are you charging the Squirrels money?" "No, sir. That would be ridiculous. They don't have pockets." "So no currency is changing hands?" "Only the currency of joy, officer." Miller let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh disguised as a cough. He walked around the bistro. He inspected the roof. And this structure? Under 3 feet, I said quickly. HOA Bylaws Section 8D. I checked. It's a loophole. A loophole, Miller repeated. A spite loophole, I clarified. Miller rubbed his face with his hand. Okay, so no commercial activity, no money, it's just a really nice bird feeder. Squirrel Bistro, I corrected. We don't serve birds. They have no table manners. Miller bent down again. He pointed to a small red cylinder attached to the side of the bistro wall. Is that... Fire extinguisher, I said. Safety first. Tony, my contractor, insisted. It's actually a painted CO2 cartridge, but it adds to the realism. Miller cracked. He let out a snort of laughter, then quickly composed himself. Okay, he said, wiping his eyes. Okay. Look, technically you aren't breaking any laws. It's your property. You aren't selling anything. And unless these squirrels start starting a fight club, it's not a disturbance of the peace. They are very peaceful eaters, officer. Right. Miller turned back towards the house. I'm going to go tell Mrs. Higgins that there is no illicit business operating here. But Mr. Miller? Yes? Maybe keep the noise down? If the squirrels start singing or something, I'll have to come back. We have a strict no karaoke policy. Miller walked back to his car. I watched him knock on Mrs. Higgins' door. She opened it immediately. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the body language. Higgins pointed at my house. Miller shook his head. Higgins flailed her arms. Miller shrugged. Higgins pointed at the sky, presumably appealing to a higher power since the local police had failed her. Miller tipped his cap and got back in his car. As he drove past my house, he slowed down, rolled down the window, and shouted, "Do they take reservations?" "Booked solid till Tuesday," I yelled back. He laughed and drove off. I felt a surge of triumph. The law was on my side. The bylaws were on my side. The squirrels were on my side. But as I looked at Mrs. Higgins's house, I saw her standing in the window. She wasn't flailing anymore. She was standing perfectly still. She was holding a phone to her ear, and she was smiling. A cold chill went down my spine. Linda Higgins didn't smile when she was losing. She smiled when she had found a new weapon. I went back to the bistro. Chunky Steve had knocked over a chair. "Table manners, Steve," I scolded, setting it upright. "We have standards to maintain. We're in a war now." I didn't know it then, but the police visit was just the skirmish. Mrs. Higgins was about to go nuclear. She was about to call the one agency that strikes fear into the heart of every restaurant owner, big or small. The health department. The letter from the county health department arrived 3 days later. It wasn't orange, it was white, official, and bore the seal of the government. Mrs. Higgins had escalated the war from a civil dispute to a federal offense. "Dear Mr. Miller, we have received a complaint regarding an unregulated outdoor food service establishment operating at your address. The complaint alleges improper storage of perishable goods, nuts, lack of refrigeration, and the presence of vectors, rodents, in the food preparation area. Please be advised that all food service facilities must adhere to Code 11-42 regarding temperature control and sanitation." I read the letter in the kitchen. Sarah was making toast. She looked at the seal on the envelope. "Is that the health department?" she asked, not looking up. "It is. Dave, stop." "I can't stop, Sarah. I have a clientele to protect. Twitchy is expecting the macadamia nut special on Thursday. He has a delicate constitution." I drove to the hobby shop. Not the fun hobby shop with the remote-controlled cars, but the intense one where people build dioramas of the Battle of Gettysburg with historically accurate button counts on the uniforms. I found what I needed in the modern dollhouse aisle, a 1/12 scale stainless steel refrigerator. It actually opened. It had tiny crisper drawers. I also bought a battery pack, a soldering iron, and a miniature LED light. I spent the next 6 hours in the garage. I wired the fridge so that when you opened the door, the light came on. I installed a tiny computer fan on the back to simulate the hum of a compressor. It didn't actually cool anything, but legally, storage units only had to be capable of maintaining separation from contaminants. I placed the fridge on the bistro's porch next to the grease trap Tony had installed. I filled it with acorns. Then, I went to my computer. I downloaded the official County Health Sanitation Grade template. I scaled it down. I gave myself an A. I printed it on a sticker and affixed it to the bistro's front window. But I knew that wasn't enough. If I was going to beat Higgins on sanitation, I needed to look the part. I dug through my closet. I found my tuxedo vest from my cousin's wedding in 2009. It was tight, buttons straining against physics tight. But it zipped. I threw a white towel over my arm. The next time I went out to refill the bowls, I didn't just walk. I presented. I marched out the back door. I bowed to the empty yard. I used silver tongs to transfer the walnuts from the jar to the tiny ceramic plates. I wiped the rim of the plates with the towel. Mrs. Higgins was there, of course. She was watering her hydrangeas with the aggression of someone trying to drown them. "It's refrigerated, Linda," I yelled, pointing to the dollhouse fridge. "And we have an A rating. Cleanest kitchen in the district." She dropped the hose. She stared at the tuxedo vest. She stared at the tiny fridge light flickering in the twilight. "You are insane," she shouted. "You are a lunatic." "I am a proprietor," I shouted back. "And we are introducing a dress code. No shirt, no shoes, no service, though we make exceptions for fur." Just then, a rumble shook the driveway. Tony was back. He wasn't scheduled. I hadn't called him. But the black F-350 pulled in, and Tony marched into the backyard carrying a bundle of cedar shakes and a look of grim determination. "Tony?" I asked. "What's going on?" "I couldn't sleep," Tony grunted. He set the wood down on the deck. "I was thinking about Chunky Steve. He's a big guy. The ground floor tables, they're tight. He needs room to maneuver." "Tony, the budget is closed." "No charge," Tony said, pulling out his hammer. "This is pro bono. I'm adding a VIP lounge, 2nd story, open air, views of the neighbor's bird bath. It's going to be exclusive." "Tony, you're crying." "I got sawdust in my eye," Tony roared, wiping a tear from his cheek. "Now hand me the glue gun. We're putting in a spiral staircase." By the end of the week, the Nutty Bistro was a 2-story architectural marvel. It had a VIP section. It had a functioning dumbwaiter, a pulley system made of dental floss. It had a tiny velvet carpet on the stairs. Mrs. Higgins had stopped yelling. She had stopped calling the police. She had gone silent. And that terrified me more than the noise. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the basement of the community center, a room that smelled of floor wax and despair. The fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. The room was packed. Usually these meetings were attended by 3 people: Mrs. Higgins, the treasurer, a man named Bob who slept with his eyes open, and Mr. Henderson, who only came to complain about the youth of today. Tonight, it was standing room only. Word had spread. The Nutty Bistro had become a local legend. People I had never spoken to, neighbors from 3 streets over, were there. I saw Tony in the back row, wearing a clean shirt, holding a schematic drawing rolled up in his fist. I sat in the front row, wearing my tuxedo vest. Sarah sat next to me, wearing sunglasses and a hat, trying to pretend she was in witness protection. Mrs. Higgins stood at the podium. She looked like a general addressing the troops before a losing battle. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked tired, but her eyes were cold. "I call this meeting to order," she said. The gavel bang was weak. "First item on the agenda," she said, skipping the minutes. "The situation at 42 Maple Drive?" She clicked a remote. A projector screen descended. The rodent menace. A public health crisis. The slide featured a blurry, zoomed-in photo of a rat eating a piece of pizza in a New York subway. "This," Higgins said, pointing at the screen, "is the future Mr. Miller wants for us. Chaos, disease, anarchy." She clicked again. A photo of the Nutty Bistro. "He calls it a bistro, but let us be clear. It is a monument to disobedience. It attracts vermin. It mocks our community standards. It is weird." A murmur went through the crowd. "I move," Higgins said, her voice rising, "that the board vote to forcibly remove the unauthorized structure and levy a fine of $5,000 for emotional distress caused to the board president." Bob the treasurer woke up. "Seconded," he mumbled, then went back to sleep. "Is there any discussion?" Higgins asked, looking at me with a smirk. I stood up. I adjusted my bow tie. "I would like to speak," I said. I walked to the podium. I plugged in my laptop. "Mrs. Higgins makes some interesting points," I began, projecting my voice. "But she fails to consider the economic and social benefits of the bistro." I clicked my remote. Community engagement and wildlife integration. "Since the opening of the Nutty Bistro," I said, pointing to a graph that went sharply upward, "neighborhood morale is up 400%. I have spoken to neighbors who used to close their blinds. Now, they watch, they laugh, they bond." "It's true!" Mr. Henderson shouted from the back. "I saw a squirrel eat a macadamia nut with a fork. Best day of my life." "Furthermore," I continued, clicking to the next slide, "the structure is fully code compliant. Section 8D, under 3 feet. Section 14B, designated dining structure. And as for sanitation," I flashed a photo of the Grade A sticker on the tiny fridge. "We are cleaner than the communal pool, Linda." Laughter rippled through the room. "But," I said, dropping my voice for dramatic effect, "Mrs. Higgins' main argument is that these animals are vermin, that they are nuisance wildlife." I reached into my briefcase. I pulled out a stack of papers. They were notarized. "I anticipated this argument," I said, "which is why, as of this morning, I have filed paperwork with the state." I held up the documents. "Meet Chunky Steve, Twitchy, and Duchess," I announced. "They are no longer wild animals. They are my legally adopted free-range emotional support animals." The room went silent. You adopted the squirrels?" Higgins whispered. "I did," I said. "I have a letter from my therapist. Watching them eat reduces my cortisol levels. Taking away their bistro would be a violation of my medical needs, and possibly a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act." I turned to the crowd. "Do we want to be a neighborhood that bans therapy animals? Do we want to be a neighborhood that tears down a masterpiece of miniature architecture?" "No!" roared Tony from the back row. "That roof has copper flashing. It's heritage work." "I move," Mr. Henderson yelled, standing up, "that we grant the Nutty Bistro historical landmark status." "Seconded," shouted a woman I didn't know. Mrs. Higgins looked at the crowd. She looked at me. She looked at Tony, who was cracking his knuckles menacingly. She looked at the screen, where I had put up a picture of Chunky Steve wearing a tiny photoshopped top hat. She sighed. It was a long, deflating sound, like a tire letting go of its last breath. "Fine," she said. "Fine." Motion to table the issue indefinitely. "All in favor?" I asked. "Aye," the room shouted. "Opposed?" Silence. Mrs. Higgins slammed the gavel down. "Meeting adjourned. I'm going to Florida." The room erupted in applause. Tony ran up and hugged me, nearly cracking 3 of my ribs. Sarah, despite herself, was smiling. We had won. We had fought the law, and the nuts won. I walked out of the community center into the cool night air. I checked my phone. A notification from the Ring camera in the backyard. It was a video. Chunky Steve was on the VIP balcony. He was sitting on the velvet carpet. He looked at the camera. And I swear, just for a second, he gave me a thumbs up. It was probably just him scratching his ear, but in that moment, I knew. The bistro was here to stay.